Welcome to the Explore God Open Forum. We're live here in Austin, Texas at Gateway Church. And with me is lead pastor John Burke of Gateway Church and also author, and Dr. Walter Bradley, author of The Mystery of Life's Origins, acclaimed speaker, and your doctorate is in material science and thermodynamics. Yeah. And we're going to be answering questions revolving around, does life have purpose? And there's more than 300 churches here in Austin who started this conversation this week, yesterday, here. And we are going to take your questions live via Twitter. So before we move on into the next segment here, I want to make sure you guys know how to engage. So use the hashtag ExploreGodQA. That's ExploreGod, the letter Q, the letter A. Add that to your hashtag on Twitter, and I'll see those questions right here, and I'll be feeding those to Dr. Bradley and to John Burke. And I really want to get into your questions right now, and we have a great one that kind of sets up where you guys come from, which will be important to kind of give some context to what these two men are saying tonight. It helps to know where you guys come from. And Andrew Dupuy, I don't want to butcher your names, he asked this: from where do these men derive knowledge about the purpose of life? What makes their knowledge sound? So maybe from an educational standpoint, maybe some life experience. Where are you guys coming from tonight? So we can get a little context of what you guys are going to be saying the next 45 minutes.
I read a book once.
You stayed at a Holiday Inn Select last night?
Why don't you start?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think as a college student, I actually was persuaded coming out of high school that the real purpose in life was to be successful. And so I pursued very diligently in high school as well as my first couple of years in college. Success is my God in a practical sense. And what I found with success was it wasn't a very good God. Success would bring happiness for the moment. It would bring meaning and significance temporarily. But a week later, a month later, that melted pretty fast. Mm-hmm. And I began to think there has to be something more to life than just being successful, making money, building a name for yourself, being a recognized person on campus and so forth. And so I think probably the middle of my college experience, I began to do a lot of reading and thinking. I was very much influenced by a wide range of authors, some of whom were very hostile to Christian faith, like Sartre, Camus, the existentialist writers. I was a product of the 60s, and the 60s was a rather turbulent time where we actually spent a fair amount of time talking and arguing about what was really going on in life, and it was a very interesting time to grow up. I also read C.S. Lewis and some writers that were very intellectually, I think, challenging, who happened to be believers. And I think along the way I also was an engineering physics major as an undergraduate and was trying to figure out what, if anything, did science bring to this conversation? What did it really have to offer to me by way of guidance about what the possibilities are? Because I think science is better at eliminating bad possibilities, but it doesn't ultimately prove the good ones, okay?
Right.
But it does give some hints, some indications. And so sort of I think all of those together, particularly during my 2 years in undergraduate school and then my 3 years in graduate school at UT, gave me a lot of opportunities both in reading and in discussing with other people who were on a similar journey to try to find the meaning and purpose of life. And ultimately, I made a choice, and the choice was to believe that ultimately my purpose here is to know God and to experience Him in the richest possible way. I like the saying of Jesus, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And I truly was a slave to my pursuit of success. Yeah. You can be that, and I was that. And I found when I finally came to realize that although success is important, it's not ultimate, that I began to experience real freedom for the first time. So I
Talk a little bit about you've had quite a bit of success in
Well, I've been very blessed. I didn't give up on success. I've continued to make that important. I got my PhD when I was 24 and I had my first teaching job as an assistant professor at that age. I was tenured after 3 years, which is pretty unusual. And over the years, I've had some nice professional success along the way. I'm an elected fellow of the Society of Materials and was Professor of the Year for the Society of Plastics Engineers in 2011, which is a one award per year for all of the United States and England combined.
Wow.
I've had the opportunity to be a consultant for many Fortune 500 companies, and so I've had a lot of fun.
So you've done all right for yourself.
I've done all right. I have to say, had I pursued success as my guide in the way that I was doing in college, though, I would have probably been a little more successful professionally, but I would probably not have stayed married 48 years. I probably would have not had children grow up with whom I have a wonderful relationship and who have gone on to be very excellent people in their own right. The things besides sort of professional success, I've been very blessed to experience.
Yeah.
And it was because what my Christian faith brought me was a way of balancing these different competing interests and opportunities in a way that gave ultimate meaning and purpose and not proximate.
The career and the relationship.
Yeah,
Yep.
the careers and relationships. It's easy to be so career-oriented that you sort of do that at the expense of the important relationships in life with other people as well as with God. And I found that for me, I was such a type A person. You don't get down the track as fast as I did unless you're fairly type A.
Clearly.
But I could have been type A to a train wreck fault. And happily, I managed to realize before that happened that there are other more important things to explore and to embrace.
Right on. John, where are you coming from?
I should have gone first.
Give us a little bit. Yeah, follow that up.
I don't
Good
have
luck.
near those credentials.
Young buck.
Yeah, no, not quite that. But, well, interestingly, I studied engineering as well. University of Texas, same place.
Am I? You get a bunch of nerds.
You're
here
the
on
only
it? Oh.
non-engineer here. Yeah. I didn't last long at it, though. But maybe part of that was I also went through a time of watching my dad die of cancer. And at that time, I didn't really think that the purpose of life was much beyond all these goals I wanted to achieve, and I wanted to be just like him. He'd been very successful, and I think when that happened, it did rock my world, and it made me stop and go, wait a second, because on his deathbed, he looked at me and he said, "John, I'd give it all back if I could just have my health and my family."
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was kind of like, whoa, I was headed down the exact same road. And actually, I did head down the exact same road, but I couldn't get that out of the back of my mind. And in many ways, it was one of those kind of little pieces of sand in the, in the shell that makes the pearl eventually, but it rubs. And I went into engineering for a while and did that for a while, but I think because of the way my mind works, I think about life and about purpose a lot.
Yeah.
And it eventually did lead me to faith. I've been a pastor for about 25 years now, and particularly to people who struggle with belief. And that's been a big part of what we've tried to do, is create a place where people can have questions and doubt and wrestle and struggle, because that's what I needed. To really consider who is God, and why does that matter, and does it make sense?
Right.
So a lot of things we're probably going to talk about.
So we got a good dynamic on the couch. Then we got John, who's going to be tackling some of the spiritual issues, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of overlap. And Dr. Bradley will be getting into some of the science, and we're gonna have some good questions on that. I've already got a few here. And Rhonda Vick asks, how do we know if we've fulfilled our life's purpose or not? Just go for the home run swing right now.
Yeah, well, that's a huge question that I think no person, and surely not I, can answer for Rhonda. But this is a very interesting thing, because if you think about it, we all kind of have this idea of who the successful people are or aren't in society. They get held up. And yet, most of the time, most people will never live up to the definition of who those successful people are. They're famous, they've made some giant accomplishment, or they have billions of dollars or millions of dollars, whichever. And the truth is, most of the people on planet Earth will never become that. And I think that is a I think that's a key, actually,
Yeah.
is that maybe success can only be defined by our Creator. And success for one person, I mean, I have friends who, one of my best friend's daughters was born basically where she's got trisomy 13. She's in a wheelchair. She'll never talk. She'll never walk. And I look at the way they care for her and the impact she's had, not only on that family, but their friends as well. And you go, what if their purpose had to do with being faithful with the challenges that they've been given and truly loving others through it? That will never get celebrated in Time magazine.
Mm-mm.
But if there is a God and that's the way it works, then being faithful to what he's given us, everybody can do that. I think that makes a whole lot more sense than the kinds of purposes we elevate in society.
You make it sound so easy, and I kind of want to jump off that question to another one from, I want to say Archer Lesh on Twitter here, and he kind of puts it in two parts. He asks, how would you respond to someone that believes the origin of life is a numbers game? And he goes on to say, reference that to say, as if to say there's a fraction of a chance for the right circumstances because the universe is so big that life will happen. I mean, there's so much possibility. Isn't it just a numbers game, and given enough time and things that this can happen?
Yeah, I think that you can never dismiss the possibility that life could have happened by chance. The question is it the more reasonable option of the two? If in fact the probabilities of this happening based on what we know today, and obviously that's a moving target, but based on what we know today, I think the probability of that happening is extraordinarily small. On the other hand, people can say, no matter how small it is, it could have happened. And that's obviously a possibility, right? I think that's why when we talk about, I give talks called, is there scientific evidence for the existence of God? And the second or third slide I show always says, look, let's start by acknowledging that at the end of the day, you can never ultimately prove or disprove the existence of God.
Right.
Okay?
To
In
be
some
clear,
sense, it's, well, partly because of what we don't know, but partly because the ultimate existence of God is really a discussion of primary causes, and science deals with secondary causes. So there's both methodological reasons and as well as theological reasons why I think you can't do that. But I think what is fair to say then is what seems most reasonable based on what we know today. And so I think we can look and speculate, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. In our book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, Reassessing Current Theories, we essentially looked at all of the different challenges, and a lot of these end up being statistical. In a sense, the numbers game is the question you're asked. And a lot of these you can, in fact, do calculations based on what we now understand, and look at what are the probabilities of this happening, and then you can try to figure what are the probability resources having to do with the size of the universe, the amount of organic matter, and so forth. But all of those are filled with sufficient number of assumptions and speculations and things that we don't know, that I think at the end of the day you don't get a nice clear-cut answer. Is it possible life could have happened entirely by chance? The answer is of course. Any improbable event could potentially have happened by chance. But is it more reasonable to bet on that, if I can use the term bet, than to bet on what seems to me a more reasonable alternative?
It seems to me maybe the science community writ large is beginning to have to face up to this question of why, not just the how and what. Are you seeing that in your conversations and with your colleagues? Are they interested in even getting into the questions of why?
Well, I think that if you look at what's popular in books today, I would say that question has been popular for quite a while in astronomy, where there seems to be a much greater interest and willingness to acknowledge the amazing characteristics of the universe and so forth.
Right.
I think when it comes to life science, maybe a somewhat stronger pushback against anything that looks like teleology. Some people want to say, well, if you have
Back
teleology.
up, back up. That was a big word. What?
Direction.
Well, I have to throw a few out just so I look like, I know
Here's
I'm
what
talking
he
You win.
means.
Yeah. The term teleology simply means that things have a direction.
Right.
And so people could say, for example, can you ultimately have mutation, natural selection, produce the complex conscious human life that we have today? And interestingly enough, Stephen Jay Gould wrote a very famous book called Wonderful Life, in which he specifically addresses that question. And he says, if you were to run the tape of life over, you would get a very different set of plants and animals, and almost surely not complex conscious life. And he's acknowledging in that comment that there is a chance element to the evolutionary process that makes it very stochastic and somewhat serendipitous, okay?
Unlikely that this would have happened.
Right, unlikely that, that you would get the same set. He's saying that the destination is completely accidental. So where you end up, we're saying if we call ourselves sort of the omega point of evolution to this time, then we would say that, or he would say that the fact that we ended up where we did was a fortuitous accident on a enormous scale, unlikely to be replicated if you ran the tape of life again many times.
Right.
Simon Conway Morris more recently has been, and I should add who these guys are. Stephen Jay Gould is probably the most famous American paleontologist before his death. He died several years ago.
Dealing with the fossil record.
Dealing with fossil record. Simon Conway Morris is maybe the most famous paleontologist today from Cambridge University. He did all the Burgess Shell work in Canada, which Stephen Jay Gould made him famous by writing about. But Simon Conway Morris begins his book and his lectures by saying, as much as I appreciate Stephen Jay Gould's making me famous for the Burgess Shell work, I have to totally disagree with one of his basic premises. He says, I think if you ran the tape of life again, you might get a somewhat different set of plants and animals. There is some element of chance and serendipity, but I think at the end you would always get complex conscious life. He says, I think there is a deeper design in nature that does in fact take us in a certain direction.
I think we'll be able to touch on that in a couple questions
Sure.
down the road.
Okay.
Let's shift gears drastically here, John. I want to throw one your way. From Sheila Hopner, I hope I'm saying that right, Sheila. She asks, how do we reconcile things like the Syrian crisis or the Holocaust with God's purpose for us?
That is a big question.
That's massive.
Well, I think the only way to reconcile it is looking at what does God say the purpose of life is. And I think if you don't buy into this, then I think you have real struggle with seeing what happens in life.
Okay.
So according to the scriptures, the purpose of life is love. That's what Moses said. That to love God was the first and foremost command. Jesus came back and said, you sum up the whole Bible, all the Old Testament prophets, if you love God and love people. And if that's the case, then you've got a situation in which God is creating creatures that can truly love him. But in order for God to create creatures that can truly love him, he's got to create creatures that can truly choose not to love him. We've got to have free will.
Right.
And I like to say it like this, we've all had the situation probably where, we've liked somebody. We've wanted them to like us back, right? You fall in love with someone. You can want them to love you, but you can't force them to love you. I mean, even, worst case scenario, you kidnap them and put a gun to their head and make them do things or say things that sound loving, but we all know that would not be love.
Right.
You take away free will, you take away what the real heart of love is all about. And that's what God has created this world to be. In other words,
So that's the game set. That's what we're dealing with.
exactly.
That's our reality.
And I think that is what explains so much of why life is the way it is. Even why God stays hidden somewhat is that he creates a world that doesn't last forever. Even though I think, honestly, we are eternal creatures, but I think only here for a short amount of time. I think that's why we struggle so with purpose and with meaning and with identity. You know, I mean, lower life forms don't struggle with those kinds of things. You know,
Right.
you don't see cats feeling worthless because they're not dogs.
They're also not trying to create anything. They're just existing.
Yeah, there's
Survival of the fittest.
But I think you do. I think you do see that we live in a world where we get a taste both of God's goodness and beauty and love and these things that He says come from Him, and we get a taste of life apart from Him, where He doesn't force His will all the time, where we truly have the ability to do horrific things to one another, but also to do things just out of self-will, out of self-centeredness rather than God-centeredness, that just creates chaos. I mean, all you have to do is look at the simple fact that people who love each other get married, and they love each other more than any other person on the planet, and yet most can't seem to keep it together.
Right.
There's a problem. And so I think that does explain why there is so much pain and suffering in this world. But, you know, kind of back to the teleology question.
You
got
got it right. You said it right.
It has a purpose. It has a direction itself. And the direction and the purpose is to cause us to stop. And, you know, we have this tendency to want to make this life into heaven for ourselves, utopia. It's all about me and feeling good and being happy. And life has a way of rocking that out of you. Just wait. I mean, I experienced that fairly early on.
That's
But
the cost of free will.
well, and I mean, you know, eventually you come to the end of yourself. Eventually life breaks most people, and then they go, okay, now what in the world is this all about? And that's on purpose, you know, because we weren't meant to just cling to what we can hold on to for 70 years. Because it's a long, slow warning that won't work.
To
you know?
to follow up her question, because this is the next question people ask in this. But some of those atrocities, the Holocaust, what's happening or may be happening in Syria and throughout the world, these massive atrocities, even natural disasters, if God cares, I mean, sure, I don't expect Him to step in, you know, when I fall off my bicycle, but maybe step up, God, when a tsunami's coming or something. What would you say to that? Because that's where a lot of people go when we answer this question.
You want to jump in? You want me to?
Go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah, I got one for you,
I thought
Dr.
you had a
Brad.
science answer.
Yeah.
Get science to answer that?
Yeah. Well,
Unfortunately not.
yeah, I mean, I think a part of it again is what we don't see is beyond this 70 years. And I think from God's perspective, if what God sees is our eternity, then the things that happen in the 70 years, they show both the height of the level of love we were created for and the opposite. So think about it like this. You know, a dog can love more than a cat.
I agree with you. I'm sure you've offended somebody.
I have
out there
offended all kinds of
with the
people.
cat
more
world.
affectionate.
More than a parakeet, okay? We'll keep it neutral.
Okay.
We won't go into the dog-cat war. So a dog can love or demonstrate something like affection, you know, more than, say, a reptile, right? But a dog can also kind of rebel and go against its master's will to a greater degree than a reptile.
Right.
Right? A reptile just doesn't do either, really.
Right.
And humans have a far greater ability to love and go to a depth of love, but they have an equal and opposite depth of the kinds of evils they can do.
Is that the same reason I can love my kids on a level I can't understand, but can make me angry on a level I can't understand.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think the point is that God creates us with a capacity, and it's a great capacity. And it's a capacity where you can see the sacrificial love of a Mother Teresa or a Jesus,
Yeah.
right? But you can also see the horrific capacity of, Nazi Germany or Rwanda, or or a father raping his daughters. I mean, there are atrocious things that happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me add one thing. I gave a talk several years ago at Harvard where there were 700 people there, and one of the questions that came up was exactly this question, but in a very specific way. A professor there stood up and he said, "I'm a professor of parasitology," which is to say he studies parasites.
Okay.
And he said, "Why would a good and loving God ever create a world in which there are parasites?" Okay. And my first answer was, I have no idea. I think the problem of pain and suffering is probably the single most difficult question.
It is.
But I speculated in two ways. If this life was all there was, then we would have to say that the untimely death of a child or the difficult life of an adult can never ultimately be justified. But if in fact this life is a hiccup in front of eternity, then it may be that suffering, to the extent that it has redemptive purposes, could actually be well justified. I would much rather live in this brief years that I have here, maybe with some degree of suffering, if that suffering causes me to see my human limitations, that maybe draws me closer to God. Not that God causes the suffering, but he certainly permits it. And the redemptive purposes would be so enormous that the suffering would be well justified.
Right.
My father committed suicide when I was 14. My brother died at the same time. And I will never, ever be able to fully explain how that happened. It doesn't make any sense at all. My father was a very committed Christian. Much later, I found out that he was bipolar, and they didn't know what that was in 1956. I found that out because my sister's bipolar, her son's bipolar, and so forth. So I have to say that I don't have any really what I think of as sort of slam dunk answer.
Right.
But I have some ideas of why God may, in fact, allow these things. And I have to say, in my own life, the times I've grown most have not been the times when things were going well. The times I have grown most as a human being in every possible way have come in those difficult, dark hours and days that we all go through at different points in our lives. And so I can see that God can use the pain and the suffering in the world to have a redemptive purpose. And if this life is only the preface to eternity, then maybe what happens in this life doesn't have to completely add up, so to speak, as justified in my mind. Okay?
Is that a bailout?
Yeah.
No, and this is a question we're going to deal a whole week with.
Yeah.
We're going to spend
Yeah,
an
it's a
entire
I don't want to get
week.
lost in this one too much.
It's
Yeah.
a really good question.
It's a great
Let me move
question.
into another question. This is from from TLL, and it's kind of like kind of a starter into another conversation. But we'll start with this. He says, with shrinking numbers of people taking up the occupation of faith, what do you expect to see the future of faith in God? Obviously, this is just speculation. It seems the younger people are walking away from faith. What's the future? And let me add on to that, even currently, what's the role of the institutional church or institutional religion in a bigger definition in this? John?
Well, I would push back on that assumption
Okay.
that people are walking away from faith.
Okay.
And maybe
Well, in his defense, he's saying taking up. They're not even starting, let alone walking away.
Well, and let me say this, that maybe he means in particular a particular faith, Christian faith or church attendance or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I would agree with that in our culture. I don't at all think people are moving away from faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think we just shift what we put our faith in.
Okay.
But we're not always honest about that. That none of us know everything, right? And so what we all do is, like, we all take data points and life experiences and put together, how do we make sense of this? And then we have to put our faith in something. It's the way we were wired.
Yeah.
And it's part of what I think actually points us toward the realization that there is a God, because there is something in us that has to trust, because we're limited. Now, some people trust in humanity's progress. So they would say, I choose not to believe that there's a God. I think that's a crutch. And I believe that one day we will answer all the questions and show that we didn't need a God.
Right.
Okay, so, and the honest part would be to say, that's not science, that's faith. But I have faith in humanity or materialism or, naturalism, whatever you want to call it. But it's still faith.
Yeah.
And so I think on the one hand, all people have faith, and as they move away from faith in God, they don't move necessarily toward more rational faith. You see them believe all kinds of things. Just watch all the cable channels right now,
Yeah.
and see all kinds of things that people believe in and think are happening, whether there's good reason for it or not.
TLL followed up in another tweet. He said, he asked, because I'm contemplating that path. I think he's contemplating walking away or not engaging faith. And I wonder if faith will go to the way of the masses, or it will become more personal. So I think he's making the argument. Maybe he's had bad experiences with institutional
Oh, is
faith.
that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How can it be? I think that's a common story. A lot of people are rejecting institutional faith, not just within Christendom, but in all faiths. No.
Well, so let me say a couple of things to that. One, people have a tendency to go away from God and His purposes often.
Yeah.
And in every organization. I mean, in the workplace, in the school, in the church, it doesn't matter. And I think that's an important thing to remember if you're considering the life of Jesus, and particularly Christian faith, is that the people who rejected and crucified Jesus were the religious leaders of his day.
Right.
And that was who Jesus really pushed against, to say, hey, you are doing all these religious things, but you're missing the point of the whole thing, which is humbly walking with God and truly loving God, so He can teach you to truly love other people. And I think that is what Jesus demonstrated, and I think He demonstrated it at the point of even laying His life down. Having said that, I don't think it means all organized, that faith in an organized way is always a bad thing. I think what God desires is that we learn to become more unified, but as we follow His will and ways, not our own, because that's the problem. It doesn't matter if it's in religion or in business or wherever. When we do it our way, with us really at the center as God, that's when we cause problems for people.
Yeah. Let me add, there's been an interesting survey that's been run by UCLA for many, many years that surveys incoming freshmen to universities. Mm-hmm. And the interest in spiritual things over the period of time that survey has been run, and I think it's probably 20 years or more, hasn't changed very much. But I think there has been a gradual falling away from institutional religion, particularly with those that are, let's say, in their 20s. In the past, that used to happen as kids went through college, at least temporarily, and then they would get married, have kids, and usually come back.
Yeah.
And I think the concern today is that the coming back part doesn't seem to be happening, and I think it's something that all churches need to try to study and understand better. There have been some good books written on this. Unchristian is the name of one book that I think has a lot of good insights. And there are some legitimate reasons why this happens. I think sometimes as the church, we don't portray the image of Christ very well. Jesus seemed to be one that people who were sinners and all kinds of reprobates were drawn to and were comfortable with. And somehow in our modern expression of what it means to be a Christian and Christ-like, we've not sort of been able to emulate that at the level that we should. And so I think it's partly maybe the fault of the institutional church collectively. That's not to say every church is like that. And I think when people have a bad experience, as this questioner may have had, it would be like saying, I went out to a restaurant and I ordered a meal and I got food poisoning, so I'm never again going to eat out.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Because all restaurants are
because all restaurants could give food poisoning, right? So I think what the person needs to do, or people need to do, if they've had a bad experience, is to say, you know, that's like eating at a restaurant where the food was either bad or really bad enough to give you food poisoning. It means I'm not going back to that restaurant.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean I'm never going to eat out again. And I think people need to be willing to do that.
How does I got a question here. This is from Hamza, and this is kind of, I think, is going to lead into a couple other questions, and it allow you to define the purpose of life for humanity. He's kind of calling you guys out a little bit, I think. To, you know, who cares what you guys think? So I guess we got to maybe contextualize a little bit and speak from your experience.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we are coming from a Christian perspective, and yeah, I mean, and we're trying to create an environment where we can interact about it, because I do believe that it holds up to scrutiny, and I think there are a lot of good reasons to believe that God is not completely withdrawn. And that God has revealed himself in a way that we can really know him and know things about him. And it really truly gives a deeper sense of meaning and purpose, not just to our days, I think it does that, but also to the entire span of our lives. So I would not say, I'm anything special. Dr. Bradley, on the other hand, is something special, but I think it's worth considering, and that's really what we're doing in this conversation, is just asking people to consider and dialogue with us about it.
While we have you here, Dr. Bradley, I really kind of want to piggyback on some of those conversations. And what should we be looking to? People of faith are, and I'm speaking a little bit to Christians here, as they wrestle with this balance of evolution and creation, or universe created by God. Can you kind of frame, I know this is a huge conversation, but can you frame some of the roadblocks people run into on both sides of that, whether they're coming from a point of, no, everything has evolved and chance led to this, all the way to the other extreme of a young earth, no, God created and poof, there it was.
6,000 years ago. And
what are some talking points that you would really love to kind of touch on?
I think it's interesting that there's the same type of error on both sides.
Okay.
I think that some well-intentioned Christians would read what I call the data of the early chapters of Genesis, because it is data. We treat it as data, right? They maybe read into those passages data that really isn't there. They assume that it's trying to give, for example, maybe a lot of specificity about the early events of creation. And I would make this analogous to a play where the primary story in the play is that God created, and some of the other details are what I think of as props for the stage for this story. Okay, now if you get a little bit confused and consider the props as having important factual value as opposed to being incidental to the story, then you might read into the story a lot more information than is really intended. Right. I think on the science side, we also have a tendency to take the data that we have and sometimes create a story which I think is much bigger than the data would warrant, and fill in the gap, in a sense, with faith, you know?
Give an example.
Yeah.
What do you...
Well, I think that when we look at what can and can't we do, for example, with the origin of life, I think at this point there Articles coming out this year, the Journal of Astrobiology, for example, has a great article on the origin of life that talks about RNA 50 years later. This is the basic theory of the first sort of critical molecule that helped us to bridge from non-living to living.
Right.
Okay? And for 50 years, we've been trying to figure out how RNA could have ever formed in a realistic prebiotic situation. And I think that...
The early primordial Earth, and by chance.
Right. And I think that a lot of times what I see oftentimes, certainly in textbooks and sometimes even in journal articles, is people will do a lot of wishful thinking and speculating on things that I think are fairly certainly dead on arrival when it comes to being likely explanations. So I think that there's a tendency probably on both sides to want to get to an answer and take the data we have and maybe extrapolate, which we all do in science and sometimes we do in our biblical interpretation as well. And in either case, what happens then is we sort of have this gulf of people maybe overclaiming on the creation side about some details and points, and on the science side, same kind of a problem, different set of data, but again, maybe reaching too far. And the net result is then we have differences that look like they're insurmountable. But I think ultimately, if you go all the way back to Galileo, Galileo said that God has written his story of creation in two books, the book of the Bible and the book of nature. And he believed, and I think many scientists through the years have believed, that properly understood, these will ultimately give us a story that will harmonize. But we're not there yet. And maybe maybe we'll never get there in some final sense.
Yeah.
But I think I have to believe that the problem is not that this is fundamentally impossible, but that we simply are not at a place where our understanding of nature is so complete and our interpretation of the Bible is so accurate that these stories will harmonize. If God is the author of both, then properly understood, there is what I think of as final solution out there, but we don't know it yet.
Yeah,
We have to be humble enough to sort of to just say, I don't know. Sometimes we don't want to admit that.
Right.
But it's the case.
No, that's true.
And like when we talk about it here, I think it's very important to realize that this is not a central issue, honestly, for Christian faith.
No, right.
But
I would.
many times it's almost pitted that way. Like either you believe all these facts of science, the geology of the earth, plate tectonics happening over millions of years, and there are all kinds of things, or you have to throw all that out and believe that God created, and it's an either or. And on the Christian side, there are Christians who I think, with good aim, of saying, well, I want to honor the Scriptures as from God, read more into it than it necessitates.
Right.
And even using where it gets locked up many times is where Christians say, well, no, you have to believe that each of the days of creation were literal 24-hour days, and then they back it into a 6 to 10,000-year-old Earth.
Yeah, I think it's important to categorize issues by, this may be something we discuss, or this may be something that I think we need to divide over because we're different on this.
And I think that's it. Realizing, on the one hand, I don't think the Bible locks you into that.
Right.
For one thing, it says very clearly, to God, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So whose day are we talking about?
Yeah.
And since the sun and the moon hadn't even been created till the third day, it's some kind of different day, seemingly. And in Genesis 2, it uses the word day as we would use day. We might say today, as in 24 hours, or in the day of science, meaning a whole, long period of time. And it's used the same way in Hebrew. So my whole point there was that it's really a tertiary issue.
Right.
There are central issues that Christians feel very like this is very central.
Which we're going to touch on in the coming weeks.
Who was Jesus? Did he reveal God? Was he this Messiah to come? And we're gonna wrestle with that. That's a central issue.
We'll get into those.
But this is really an issue that Christians should and ought to be able to hold different opinions on, and we can wrestle with.
But I think the early chapters of Genesis unequivocally talk about creation as ultimately being God's responsibility. But the details of how he actually brought that to pass are not spelled out in any great detail.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that at this point, this is why I think when we look at questions like either the origin of life or evolution, this teleological question is really at the heart of it, because the main claim that Genesis 1 makes is that God is ultimately responsible. The particular details of how he brought that to pass, whether it's miracle or process or some combination of the two, are not, I think, spelled out. So I think that there is a certain latitude of permissible interpretation there that I think we should recognize and agree to disagree, even within Christian circles, about what actually, how it actually was accomplished.
Yeah.
Okay.
One last quick fire question as we kind of wrap up here tonight. And again, we have 6 more weeks of the online forum that you're not going to want to miss. And we may have passed over some of your questions because they probably touch on some things we're going to get into in the coming weeks. So don't feel like we ignored you. We were trying to stay focused on purpose this evening. But let me close. Michael Mitchell asks, and I think you know Michael, this is a great question. He says, what steps do you recommend someone take to find their purpose? So maybe John representing kind of theology, but also the local church, because wherever you are, you're going to have a local church near you. So next steps someone can take. And then maybe Dr. Bradley, just kind of for their own purposes and knowledge, some quick fire next steps you would recommend. John?
Well, I mean, I think the ultimate question is, why am I here?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You know? And I think really the most important thing in that is, am I created by God, or is my life really ultimately going to snuff out and I'm going to be worm munchies and, you know,
And that's it.
the sun will eventually burn out. My children's children won't remember me. My accomplishments are for nothing. That's ultimately the question, I think. And so I would say, wrestle that one down to the ground. You know, in other words, many of us make our decisions, but we make them based on what we hearsay, what other people think. But we haven't really, like, for instance, read the Bible for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Read the teachings of Jesus, and yet it's it's the most widely spread, widely distributed book in all history. So we call ourselves educated many times, but we haven't read the number one book even of all history. And I think that alone is just a beginning. Ask questions, wrestle with people about it, but nail that one down. Don't just let time wander by without really thinking about, what am I doing and why am I doing it? This weekend when I was talking about it, I used the analogy of when I was young, my father and I built this model train. Mm-hmm. And it was this incredible landscape, and it took us a year to do. Created, built it. It was just a blast. And then the day came, I plugged it in, it starts going around. My dad played with me with it for about a week, and then he kind of stopped. And I kept trying to, but I quickly lost interest. Yeah. And the reason is because it was just going around and around. It really didn't have much purpose. And I could make up little purposes. But really, I realized it was the relationship that gave purpose to
mm-hmm.
it. And I think life is very much like that. That we don't stop and think that if there is not a God, ultimately, that we relate to beyond this life, that makes something of this life, then all our accomplishments are really just going around and around. So I think I would pursue that question and nail that down, because then I think in relationship with God, we each have a purpose that's different. I can't compare myself to you and say, how am I doing? Because you've been given different circumstances in life than I have. But
which is a big hurdle for a lot of people, that we are predisposition to compare ourselves to everything.
And we drive ourselves crazy. We have all kinds of anti-anxiety medications. Why? Well, because we don't really know who we are or why we're here, and we're struggling to find that out. But I think there's real peace in coming to the resolution that in relationship with God, I can accomplish what he has me here to do. And I can be faithful to it. And, I find great peace in what Jesus said, that come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, which is most of us, and I will give you rest. Come and learn from me. For the task I have for you is light. It's not burdensome. In other words, we have a task, but we can handle it. We can do it. And it's when we put more on ourselves than God ever intended that we really get stressed out, I think.
That's good. Good answer. Dr. Bradley, some next steps for someone trying to find their life's purpose.
I'm going to be very pragmatic and
Okay.
suggest some good guides.
Okay.
If I were trying to find my way out of a woods where I was lost, I would really prefer to have a good park ranger than to have some other lost folks who are accompanying me.
Yeah.
And the people that I would recommend in particular, I would first of all recommend people take the time to read the New Testament. A lot of people have never bothered to do that, and so in some sense they have no clue of what it is that Christianity offers by way of an option or an alternative, okay?
Right.
That's a simple thing, and it's not that long. People can read it in a reasonably short period of time. I would also recommend 4 authors that have had a huge impact on my thinking, beginning with C.S. Lewis. I think one of the great thinkers of the 20th century,
Right.
who was in fact a well-known atheist, who eventually became a Christian and therefore writes with a great deal of empathy for people who have doubts and who have struggles and maybe who have been headed in a different direction. So I like him a lot. Francis Schaeffer was a person who became popular about the time I finished my PhD. And I remember beginning to read some of his books and thinking, I have a doctorate of philosophy, so I should know more about philosophy, right? Now, all PhDs are doctorates of philosophy today. They mean research, okay? But I found Francis Schaeffer opened my eyes to seeing this whole question of meaning and understanding of the world and what's wrong with me.
Which book that he wrote?
Well, Escape from Reason, The God Who Is There. There's a whole series of them by Francis Schaeffer that I really, really like. With C.S. Lewis, certainly Mere Christianity or The Abolition of Man, but almost everything Lewis writes is, for me, profound. And they were very helpful to me during my college years. More recently, I think people like Tim Keller, who wrote, for example, The Reason for God, and Lee Strobel, who wrote The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith.
And Lee was an atheist. He was a lawyer and
Yep.
reporter for the Chicago Tribune.
So I appreciate writing. I appreciate the writings of people who have, in some sense, been there as adults, as
Yeah.
atheists, and had to find their way in different ways, not necessarily the same ways,
Struggling.
to find some light that they felt like they could live by. And so that's why I would say I think that trying to do this all sort of in my own head, I think probably wouldn't have worked for me. I'd probably still be lost in the woods if I'd been doing it strictly as a kind of an introspective, exercise of some kind. So find some good guides and let them help you. At the end of the day, you have to decide what you're going to believe. But I think it's often said in science that we are where we are today because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think when it comes to faith issues, it can be the same. I think we can see a lot further if we stand on the shoulder of giants and let them help us to see things I'm probably not going to see because I'm in the high weeds and I'm not that tall.
Well, it's a good place to wrap up tonight. Dr. Bradley, I really want to thank you for being here with us tonight. And
My
John,
pleasure.
thank you for letting us set up shop in your church here.